Becky Wasserman on the mini tips. And we're going to continue, today and get some outside opinion on that one. So we're going to start with Karen Horn.
Madam Chair, could we both come up?
You certainly can. Is there a chair you can pull up?
Yes,
I
certainly.
managed to get one comfortable chair. We used to make witnesses stuff.
I never remembered that.
You never sat in that hard chair that creaked.
We failed in our duty then.
Hey, these chairs may be bad, but they don't crack when you sit on them. We had more than one split. Okay, we're here.
Well, thank you so much. And my name is Karen Horn with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Been here for 100 years. That's how I introduce myself these days. I think I might have been here longer than Senator McDonald. And thank you also so much for taking up H83. I'm just going to introduce the issue for you, which is something that we've been working on for several years. We have been talking to local governments about what potential projects might be. And you've heard, I'm sure that last October, the governor announced about $30 million in wastewater treatment projects for municipalities that they could take advantage of the ARPA dollars by December 31, 2026. And so we have 14 towns that are looking at those kinds of projects now, and really need to put all the finance stack together to get those finished and take the most advantage that they can of those projects. So we really feel like H83 would help in that regard. And I'm going to turn it over to Ted. Have you met Ted?
Maybe not in this capacity.
That's right.
This is the best capacity. I'm just
That
gonna
is the
say.
best. I can't keep a job. What can I say? At one point, Karen said to me that I had been, in the first couple of weeks, she said, I've been here 500 times longer than you have, Ted. When it was my second week on the job. So, wow, what a perspective.
So listen.
Yeah, it is. So Ted Brady, I'm the executive director at the Vermont League of Cities and Towns now. Madam Chair, as you said, came here from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development about 2 years ago. Yeah, you all know what the league does, but just a quick reminder, all 247 towns are members, cities and towns of Vermont are members, and we're here to serve and strengthen local government. What we found is that increasingly, this means looking beyond what we typically do, which is help local governments govern. Building capacity and managers and then select boards and then clerks. And what we're finding that we're spending a lot of time these days ensuring the communities remain actually economically viable so that there's a place to govern going forward. Declining grand lists, which if you've looked even in this real estate bubble, there's a lot of declining grand lists in our villages and downtowns and centers, certainly before the bubble. There's aging populations that are kind of abandoning our communities in rural Vermont. There's aging infrastructure that really hasn't been invested in since the Carter era. We're trying to find ways to help these communities tackle these problems, in addition to tackling things like open meeting law and public records law and town meeting. That's our normal charge. We've been tasked with helping towns do these other things. So ever since I became the ED back in 2021, we've done a member survey. Why is that important? Because it's showing the same thing every year, time and time again. The number one thing people are talking about, including select board members, clerks, and planning commission members, is housing. It's top list every year. Housing, local governments are eager to be a partner in solving this housing crisis as a result. The problem, not all communities have the same tools or any tools to address that issue. We have more than 50 communities in the past 2 years that have taken advantage of funding you've provided them to update their zoning laws to create more inclusive zoning. $1 million at $1 million cost, they're doing everything they can. We've got communities that have bonded for hundreds of millions of dollars in water and wastewater infrastructure in the last 3 years alone. that's still not getting us there. And we have communities starting things like housing trust funds, housing trust committees, you name it, a long list of tools we're trying to use. But the 247 towns in Vermont still don't have access to the most effective tool, which is tax increment financing. When you look at South Burlington, when you look at St. Albans, when you look at Bennington, when you look at Winooski, the reason they have so much housing being built there is because they have infrastructure to build it. Why do they have that infrastructure? Because they've been able to take advantage of hundreds of millions of dollars in tax increment financing that the smaller communities have not been able to. Project-based tax increment financing, we firmly believe, is the most effective way to allow towns to close the gap to get infrastructure built in their communities. The smallest communities can take advantage of the tool as it's drafted in S83. It's significantly different than the existing tax increment program. The existing program allows for multiple infrastructure projects. As drafted, what you have in front of you allows for one project. The existing program pledges increased revenue for hundreds of parcels. I think I heard the largest TIF is like 700 parcels. It's enormous, right? The proposal before you is like a dozen parcels. That's quite a big difference. The big changes mean small towns could rely on the program to help pay for infrastructure we need to build housing and improve the quality of life in rural Vermont. Now, one of the things I have heard is a criticism is towns don't need this right now, they're flush with money. Isn't that nice to think? The local fiscal recovery fund money that you've probably heard about gave $200 million to towns directly, at about $300 a head per person. But the league is helping towns spend that money, follow rules, and come up with ideas on how to spend that money. But every single one of our members will come up short on major infrastructure projects, even despite that money. That $300 is barely enough to afford a down payment on most infrastructure projects. So let's just look at one example, just down the road in Waitsfield. Waitsfield just had a feasibility study done to build a wastewater system in its downtown quarry. I think it's technically Irisville, is that right? You know, by the big picture and all that stuff, right?
Go from there all the way up to the shopping center with the, yeah.
We're in the downtown core along 100. The feasibility study came back and suggested a $23 million project. That $23 million would have to be shouldered by all of the residents in Waitsfield, despite the fact that Irisville, we all just talked about it, or at least a couple of us talked about it, like we know where that is, because that is the heart of the Mad River Valley, right? That's where people expect us to build housing, where people expect businesses to move. Well, they can't do it if we don't have wastewater infrastructure there. $23 million. The town of Waitsfield got $500,000 in local fiscal recovery money. Karen a moment ago talked about this $30 million, which was the biggest investment in wastewater that ANR has made in years. The biggest grant from there was about, I think, $4 million. So you can see there's a tiny gap between that $4.5 million that kind of Waitsfield might be able to count on and $23 million going forward. It's also, you know, you look at Waitsfield, there's, you know, you talk about the parcels in the village there, in the village of Irisville. It's not the entire town we're talking about making a TIF zone, a TIF district. The existing TIF program would encourage you to do that. Let's take a project in the downtown, but then let's surround, you know, the 100 parcels around that downtown and say all these parcels are going to benefit from this program. So we're going to take the tax increment from all those parcels. This idea would be, let's look at the parcels that are going to change dramatically because of this project and use that to pay off a portion of this debt. And that's another thing. It's the portion of that debt, not the entire debt. Like a lot of the tax increment financing districts are 10, 20, 30, bigger $1 million total projects. The proposal here is for a small portion of that debt, not the entire piece. I also hear frequently that towns don't have the capacity to figure out the tax increment financing district program. These towns are figuring out these complicated federal grant programs. And I can say from experience, I was at USDA Rural Development, a water and wastewater grant application to the federal government makes a project-based TIF application look like child's play. They are reams of paper. They require professional consultants, and only the most sophisticated towns have historically been able to get the largest grants from the federal government. You look at Virginia's, the Burlington, the Colchester, they've been able to do pretty well by some of those programs. So Karen mentioned we've got more than 24 projects that identified currently that would like to take advantage of this program. It was only 2 weeks ago that we convened about 36 communities and said, are you interested in this program? Here's what it would look like. And just in the last 2 weeks, 5 of those communities, Fairhaven, Highgate, Middlebury, Pulteney, St. John, and Westford, with they've already written to their legislative delegations saying, we need this tool. And we anticipate probably another dozen or so, maybe more, will be writing to their legislative delegations in the coming weeks to say they need this tool. Don't worry, I'm almost done. There's only 2 more paragraphs here. Thanks for putting up with me. Finally, I just want to say these project-based TIP districts are designed to be accessible to these smaller communities, but these smaller communities have tools to help them navigate a program like this. Most notably, the regional planning commissions would step forward, the regional development corporations. We've got private consultants that help. The Vermont Bond Bank, when a town goes to place its a bond, it's talking to Michael Don and his team at the bond bank. They're experienced in this and they're able to assist towns in figuring this stuff out. The existing program requires something that's far too complex for a small town. This program would reduce those complexities and make it accessible. Finally, I don't want to sit here and pretend that TIF is perfect. I understand that it has warts like every other federal and state government program out there, but we actually went to a private consultant, to an economist at the University of Wisconsin last year, in cooperation with Matt Dunn's group down in Hartford, the Center on Rural Innovation.
I was going to say he testified, but that was in the other committee.
On this topic?
On housing development.
So their group, we commissioned a study to look at the tax increment financing program and asked them really quite simply, is it meeting the legislative intent of spurring growing tax revenues? So that report had these 10 findings. And when I'm done here, I'm done, so don't worry. TIF serves as a powerful long-term planning tool. There is no other development tool out there that has successfully put growth where we want it, more so than this in our designated centers. It also found that measuring the performance of TIF districts is extremely complicated. So this is not a report that came back to us glowingly and said this is a perfect tool. It also said the revenue story is just as complicated, but their research showed that TIF districts generate net revenue growth in the education fund above the naturally occurring growth. I should point out that the auditor took great offense to our report and audited the report. We made every single change he asked us to make to reflect what he found were the errors in the report. We had the economists run the report again, and they came to these same 10 findings, including the one that said the ed fund generated net growth to the ed fund.
Can you get us a copy of that report?
Absolutely. Found that the TIF generates a clear rate of economic growth not recognized in previous analysts' analyses. It forecasts a rate of return from, it said that forecasting the rate of return from TIF is complicated. I've seen the JFO reports that say this is how much it returns. We've seen conflicting reports that say it generates much more. It also found that TIF produces conditions that allow communities to leverage other assistance. You look at a place like St. Albans and all the growth that occurred there outside of TIF, in addition to the tens of millions in TIF funds. This one is a really important fact, is that the combination of safeguards built into Vermont's TIF statutes maximize its effectiveness and accountability while reducing risk. The report found that Vermont's TIF is one of the most restrictive in the country. I should point out, project-based TIF might make TIF the most restrictive TIF program in the country. Maybe that's a source of pride, right? We restrict what you can use this for to make sure you get the biggest public. One of the things it was unable to do, but we firmly believed we love to do, is compare TIF to other state economic development tools. If you give a town $2 million for its wastewater project, that's a wonderful thing, a grant. But somehow TIF leverages more money than a grant would. And that's something that's lost. And then finally, can you guess what the last conclusion was? Vermont's TIF policy must change in order for rural communities to use the program. And so that's where I'll leave it. In order for smaller communities to use TIF, We need to change the program. We think S83 does a great job of bringing us there.
I think on Friday, we went through the bill. Tell me if I didn't remember correctly. It was obvious the towns need some help to do these big projects. The question was a TIF the way to go? And then just making sure that that infrastructure to help towns that don't have planners and finance departments are able to use them. The big hang up on this is the impact on the ed fund. So I think, and that's always been where the limits of it. So I think we might have to do away with big TIFs in order to do little TIFs, but we're gonna have to find a way because the ed fund's back under a lot of pressure. And yes.
The regional TIFs were a great impact on the town's municipal budgets. They built the infrastructure and they didn't contribute the tax money to the town's municipal budgets. They took that money to pay back their loans. That was a decision towns made. What appears to be in this bill is that your decision is not to pay back the money to the ed fund. You just don't send the money to the ed fund, so you're essentially borrowing from it. You don't pay the interest on it until you've paid back the cost of doing the infrastructure with town money. And the ed fund just apparently absorbs the not getting the money. That's it. Who wouldn't take that?
So let's take Westford as an example. Then the center of Westford, Vermont, it's like the center of a lot of rural towns, even though it's in Chittenden County, right? It's got a church, an old church. It's got an abandoned store or two. It's got a back lot filled with some big rigs that aren't used anymore, and next to a farm. They want to build a wastewater treatment facility in that.
That's what TIFs were for.
Yeah, it's $4 or $5 million. It's not a huge dollar figure, but Westford's never been able to get there because there's only about 10 parcels in downtown Westford that would benefit from this program. The bond for a $4 or $5 million program in a town like Westford, the people in the sticks, including the guy that has the giant middle finger statue, Kid Rock, had copied, aren't interested in bonding for that downtown. TIF allows, and so to answer your question, TIF, if you use this project-based TIF in a place like Westford, you have parcels in town that would immediately go up in value because of the water and wastewater treatment plant. And it's a clear line. It's not like the larger TIF where there may be an argument that a parcel on the outskirts of town maybe is not directly related to this project. There's a lot of different things that create that. In this case, you cannot put a new store in downtown Westford without a wastewater project. You know this, so please forgive me, but I think Westford, the perfect example, that parcel goes from a $200,000 valuation to a $400,000 valuation in 2 or 3 years. The ed fund immediately gets, I can't remember, 70-30 in this bill. I should have it in front of me.
It
Immediately gets 30%, I believe, of the increment. So the ed fund immediately is making more money the day that parcel is worth more money.
Yes. But if you borrowed from a bank, the bank wouldn't get 30% of what it had loaned you. It would get what it had loaned you. So who's making up the difference?
The ed fund will receive not a penny more if the water system is not built in Westford.
Correct. Nor would the bank if it had been built.
Well, and at the end of the life of the TIF, the ed fund is going to get the full increased new increment.
This is getting into the argument I don't allow in this committee.
Which is understanding how it works.
No, which is, some people believe that the system, that the growth would happen if we did nothing. And other people believe it would. We are choosing to allow, and it's town, it's not just, it worked perfectly when it was just the town and the town's school budget. Because it was all the town's money and it's the town's taxes that were doing it. Got complicated when we went to a state education tax, because now arguably the, the state fund is not getting all it would have if, that TIF setup hadn't been there. Now, whether or not that we would have gotten anything because nothing happened, or those are, I have not found, I found that these are deeply held beliefs, not subject. Argument doesn't change it.
So, Madam Chair,
Yes.
before, under the original TIF bill, a town received state aid to education foundation plan based on how much tax base they had. And when you put in a TIF, when you built something, infrastructure, you had more things, you had more tax base, and you lost state aid. The town lost state aid. Under this bill, the town essentially borrows from the ed fund on money and doesn't lose anything. So if the town doesn't lose anything, it's not borrowing from a bank, the bank tells them you have to pay back, so it's borrowing from the ed fund. And the ed fund loses. So if the ed fund is competing with the banks, but it can't charge interest on what it's borrowed from the ed fund, it's not apples to apples.
No, this is I think we're just gonna go forward because I've got lots of witnesses.
I've said my piece, I'm sure. It's on the record, and I will let you.
Okay,
Oh, away we go.
you're on the record. And you are not alone. You are a spokesman for a sizable group of people in this building. I guess Westford has definitely been in here before. My concern, and Jones was supposed to be here at 2. Am I still got the correct? That they're only talking about a septic system. But living in a town that got one of those federal grants, and I think the last of them from the state, we went to a revolving loan. Those facilities require extensive upgrades, expensive upgrades. And if the town can't afford to put in the facility, are they going to be able to afford to maintain that facility?
No.
And I think those are the kinds of fiscal analysis that the town is going to need somebody to walk them through, because it isn't, maybe Westford's, because they were talking about a giant septic tank. They weren't talking about a, wastewater treatment. But I think that's one of the questions. And then,
Yeah, well, I think frequently these projects take a half dozen to a dozen funding streams, right? They take a
yeah,
grant.
they are borrowed from the bank.
They borrow from the bank, they borrow from the federal government, they take a grant from the federal government, they, it's different. But it's all part of the funding stack. So all these, in order to do this, it requires all of these things. Now, I know the federal grant programs at USDA and at the ANR, their grant dollar is based on the user rate. And the user rate needs to be a certain number so that they can afford to maintain their system going forward. To pay the debt, to fund your capital reserves for future years, and to actually pay for operations of the program. So there are complicated financial formulas that are done by the funders in order to make that happen. And this, like we said, this project-based TIF would only be a portion of these projects. So there's underwriting being done by multiple granting and loan making authorities.
Okay.
So just preface it, I'm a big proponent and advocate for TIFs. I understand them and what the benefits are and how they keep the ed fund whole. My concern, or that I'd love for you to speak to with project-based TIFs is, I know Westford well. I've spent a lot of time in Westford, and I know they are extremely confident they can absolutely fill out those grants. So your example, they have that technical expertise. My concern is the time that it takes, the labor, the expertise to maintain overtime. Like a grant is one and done, that sort of project, and then you get it approved and then you focus on the other thing. I've seen with TIFs, it's 20 years of constant reporting that I'm worried that small towns won't be able to sustain that type of staffing levels. What would you say to allay my concerns on the staffing required for maintaining TIF paperwork and project updates?
Sure. I think this is such a smaller program that you really need to step back from what a bigger city is doing when it comes to TIF and the reporting it's doing and the amount of compliance they need to do. And you look at a town, every town in Vermont has the capability of maintaining their grants and updating their grants. You know, every town has listers. Every town has, you know, their clerk that's recording the land titles. This is just another responsibility, and it's not an overly burdensome one compared to the larger TIF program. We also think the regional planning commissions, the regional development corporations, and the private consultants are going to step forward and take advantage of this opportunity. It's vitally important that those be eligible project costs, right? To allow them to pay people. This is the problem with adding capacity in towns. People think it's a great idea, but nobody wants to pay for it. In theory, the project-based tax increment financing program could potentially incorporate some element of what it costs to pay people to do this work for the life of the program.
Okay.
Can I just say, on a related note, our bill has a $750,000 appropriation for bylaw modernization. So we're asking towns that want to participate in some of these programs to do a lot, but we're also trying to find funding so that they have what the tools they need.
But it's, yeah, I mean, some of our towns don't even have a part-time manager, and they have a clerk. That is Joe. Okay.
So I just one additional point to that, Senator. The towns that have indicated interest in the project-based TIF to date, most of them, almost all of them, do have a town administrator or a town manager. And I just mentioned that you passed, I believe you passed, the Budget Adjustment Act, which includes funding in the short term to build that capacity in small rural communities.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. We're right.
Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Okay. Commissioner, welcome.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thanks.
Behind you. I think you're sitting in the place I parked in this afternoon.
She knows which committee she's in.
Yeah, Capital Cannabis. That's really good. Okay. Okay, welcome.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not right there, but scheduling has forced Zoom, so hopefully that's okay and everyone hears me okay.
That's fine. I actually prefer Zoom because the room is not too crowded and you don't have to travel, so.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for hearing out the testimony for project-based TIF. As you too well are aware, this is probably our 5th year of going after project-based TIF. The idea came about because the TIF program in and of itself has been utilized really only by large towns and cities. And the thought was, this is not really fair. It's not really equitable that other towns that may not have a portfolio of projects to bring forward cannot then experience the benefits of having this instrument. So this year, what happened was interesting. It wasn't that we were necessarily saying, this is what we're going to go after. We had towns selling us on the idea, which was ironic because we had always thought this was an excellent idea, one such town I think you've either heard from or you will hear from this afternoon, Montpelier basically was telling us why project-based TIF was really the way to go, and that the
Well,
regular
Fraser
TIF.
is here, so.
Excellent. I couldn't tell who was all in the room, but so it was just an example of how the flexibility that project-based TIF gives. We think, okay, we're onto something here. We need to go back to the drawing board and see if we can get project-based TIF approved this year. Last year, we did an exercise. We looked at the grand list growth of every town in Vermont, and an astounding number. I want to say it was close to, like, I think it was between 150 and 200 towns had grand list growth of only, like, 1% or less. So this is not a way to build a prosperous economy, right? We need towns to have instruments available to them so that they could grow their tax base. And we all know, and we've all heard, and everyone's talking about the housing crisis. And part of that is you can't just build housing anywhere. You do need to have infrastructure available. You want walkable, you need street improvements, you need streetscape and transportation improvements, water, wastewater particularly. And without that infrastructure, you're not going to get the housing that you need. So this works very closely hand in hand with housing and with economic development. And we feel that we don't want to accept a very low grand list growth rate in the town, in the state. And we do hear these stories about towns being too small to take advantage. But remember, the beauty of project-based TIF is that it's one project. It's one project, not a multitude of projects that have to be tracked forever and ever. So it makes it that much more manageable. And we feel that if it's within our power to give towns the mechanisms and the instruments with which to improve their destiny, to improve their prosperity, we should by all means exercise that right to have them do what's right for their particular residents. And people need a place to live, they need a place to work. We need to give towns the right to build the infrastructure, give them that ability. And if it means that postponing the education tax for that period of time to pay back to pay back the debt, then by all means, let's get that going. It's not as if we have runaway growth in all of these towns. We have the opposite.
Okay. Any questions for Commissioner Volz? I'm not hearing any. Commissioner, I think we all know one of the issues with TIFs is that it's money that doesn't go immediately into the ed fund. And we've already had that argument, and we're not going to have that now. But I think to get something through this building, we are going to have to show that we aren't increasing the impact or minimally on the ed fund. So I'm wondering if there would be a trade-off between big and little TIFs. That I think the towns that want to get big TIFs have probably gotten them, and we've had moratoriums, but to switch out the project base for the big town-wide TIFs. Would that be something that, I know it wouldn't be your ideal, but is that something that you could live with?
Oh, I guess I would answer the question with a question, and I'm guilty of doing that. But I guess what I would be wondering is, do we think that TIF has been used so widely, right? Remember, several years ago, we argued to get the ability to do 6 more TIF districts. And since that time, which has been probably, I want to say it's 5 years, there have been 2 TIF districts. Well, 3 were formed, but one had given it up. But we have Bennington and Hillington, which was just approved. So I don't think that there's a runaway sort of adoption of TIF in the larger cities that we would say, okay, we have to stop it. These take a long time to study, to bring about, to create the financing plan, to create the parcels, to understand which parcels are going to be included. So it takes a long time. It's not as if people are just going to take us up on it and we'll have so much going out of the ed fund. And I do think that we have to look at it that this is an investment. We're borrowing from it. And then after it's paid back, you have that much more in the ed fund than you would have had without the TIF district. So I wouldn't want to say stop it all because again, it's only good for one project and larger towns may have several infrastructure projects that they need to get accomplished. So why would we limit that ability for them to do so?
I need just a little bit of remedial tutoring here. My understanding is that the TIFs don't actually take any money out of the ed fund.
No.
It's money that gets delayed going into the.
Yes,
Okay,
they don't
yeah.
pay the increased value, and it is a very complex, the background growth, because some things would have grown a whole lot, housing, if that was your background. So it's a pretty complicated trying to figure out how much the value of that area would have gone in if but for the TIF, and
that's a controversy within the whole TIF concept.
and that's what the auditor audits, among other things. And the auditor is coming in to talk to us later, but not about this bill. But I'm sure he would, at some point, will be in to talk about this bill. So, okay.
And I think if we are worried about that, there is thought that it would have happened anyway. The data does really not bring that out, right? It's always hard to prove a negative, but when you look at the grand list valuations, it's not taking anyone a big analysis to see that it is not growing at an acceptable rate, right? It takes not too much to realize there's not enough housing. There's not enough infrastructure, in these towns to accommodate economic growth.
I think what we're hearing in housing is that we are writing zoning regulations that will pretty much require more densely populated housing developments. But the fact is, given our good clay and granite soil in this state, you can't do much of any kind of cluster, high density housing unless you have that infrastructure. And the cost of the infrastructure is beyond the means of most towns. And so they're caught with, they can't afford to put in the infrastructure, so they can't grow. And there are town centers around some of our large job centers, like Montpelier or Barrie or Burlington, where you would want to have housing for the people that work there, but they don't have the water and sewer capacity to put it there. Okay.
Just a quick comment and then a question. I mean, I think also one thing we don't take into account enough is that a community can decay very quickly too if they don't have this investment. And Winooski's often been the poster child for sort of rapid decline. I think it's fair to say they used to come in and sort of say the same thing, bankruptcy, and now look at Winooski. I mean, I think a lot of people would credit the TIF with that. Two, I think, Joan, you'd be the right person to sort of discuss this in our broader discussion, but this has often come up because municipalities don't have a lot of other tools in their toolbox. They can do local taxes, they can get a grant or some big loan or some largesse from the federal government, or this has been a tool used around the country. And since the last time we talked about it, there has been no magical new financing tool that's sort of developed that is better than a TIF.
That's correct. I mean, I think there was talk last year about how each town was going to get ARPA money, and we had a community recovery program, and it all helps. It's just that it's not a long-term solution. Whereas the ability for a town to utilize TIF, it doesn't have an expiration date, or it shouldn't have an expiration date, right? It's a tool that they could use again and again, not dependent upon the federal guidelines with ARPA, not dependent upon what the other needs of the town may be. This is really about them determining their own destiny, and which we think it should be within each town's ability to utilize that incremental revenue so that they could realize the incremental revenue. I mean, it's almost like this upfront, I was calling it borrowing before, but it's really just, it is just sort of delaying what the ed tax would get for a bigger return at the end of the period of the debt. So I don't know if I answered your question, but.
I think so. Okay. Any other questions? Anything else you think we should hear? If not, I'm gonna move on.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
All right, Bill Fraser.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Fraser. I'm the city manager in Montpelier. I have been since Senator Cummings was the mayor. I'd like to start by saying I'm a strong proponent of TIF, as is the city government. And I would also like to say that the state staff, Abby and her crew at Depsy, are fantastic to work with, very helpful. And my comments have nothing to do with them, because I think what's happened is they've been in a position of having to administer a law that's very difficult to follow. And so one of the reasons you're not seeing more communities taking advantage of these large TIFs is that they are extremely expensive and extremely cumbersome. We haven't. So I'm going to give you a little example. I'm going to answer your question, Senator McCormick, about the ed fund at the same time. We wanted to use TIF for all the reasons everybody else did. It's the only tool in the toolbox. But because the state law says we can have one district and it has to be contiguous, our key areas that we wanted to look at were downtown. You may remember the new hotel and the parking garage. It didn't happen, nothing to do with TIF, or it's another story for another day. And out by what we call Sabins Pasture, which is down Berry Street. We think there's an opportunity for housing, and actually since then the city has purchased the golf course beyond that, which we would like to use a project-based TIF. So our district ran from here to there. And so we developed a project, which was essentially a project-based TIF. We had a brand new hotel with a publicly funded parking garage paid, between user fees and proceeds from the TIF, both the state and ed fund. From that one hotel only, that new hotel, that's all we calculated our finances on. Now, we were expecting a new building across the street where there's the old gas station, which was still just an empty lot. Why isn't that there? Because the building that's going to go there is going to rely on the parking from the parking lot. Okay, so what we have now is no buildings and no money going to the ed fund. What we would have had was a new hotel and a new office building with 25% of their education tax going into the ed fund. So the ed fund would have been making money, it's not getting that, even though 75% of that would have been being used to help pay the public infrastructure to make that happen. So I don't think TIFs take money from the ed fund, I think they contribute. And it's by those kind of developments. Yeah. So but those strictly, when we did the finances for that project, we didn't think about the whole project. Now let's flip to the other end. We have some interest in developing housing at the other end. Case inside, the developers of one of the private parcels don't want to do more than 74 units because of Act 250 regulations. That's something else to be considered, because they probably handle 250 units on
At
this.
least half of this committee is working.
Yes, but, so here, now let's think about this as a policy measure. They need infrastructure, they need roads, water, sewer. We have water and sewer treatment capacity. For us, it's the lines and the infrastructure and the roads. Let's say that we did a TIF in our current TIF district to support that. And then this office building down here gets gets built, the tax increment from that office building would be being used to pay the improvements way out in Savings Pasture, because it has to be one contiguous district. That's not good policy either. So I think the issue is we should have projects that stand on their own, which most municipalities who are responsibly managed are going to do that anyway. We're not going to gamble that something new is going to be built. We're essentially designing these as project-based anyway. Yet, according to the statute, we have to guess what projects might come in this district over 10 years. And then if any of them change, we have to go through a process for substantial change because we guessed this might turn into a hotel and instead it became an apartment building. How are we to know? We did our best guess of what might grow in that district. Project-based TIFs are more versatile. They can respond to the need. They're not big town or small town, as you've heard. If Calais could build an apartment building and they needed to put in a public road to get there, and the TIF would pay for that public road, why shouldn't they be able to do that, right? Why shouldn't Montpelier be able to do a TIF here for a hotel or garage, a TIF out there for that, as long as that project stands on their own and we don't get speculated? So currently we're all listening to 1 per town up to 8 or 12 or however many units. So it's simpler to manage. We don't have to, as you know, manage all the background to the question about capacity for communities. It is
It's a
simple.
huge amount of background.
Huge, right, but even then you've got to factor in, as we talked about last year, reappraisal effects and all those other things. It's much simpler if we could do that. It helps more community and it has less of an indirect impact on the ed fund. As I said, we do Savings Pasture and this office building gets built down here. That's actually coming from the ed fund that I would even acknowledge shouldn't be, because nothing that we're doing at Savings Pasture is helping this project down here. So the idea is to get housing and any other kind of economic development. You know, we did one on our own, just using municipal money from the Caledonia Spirits Project, because we guessed how much their tax, we estimated what the taxes would be, we estimated what the water and sewer resources were going to be. But you know, we ended up having to put up, you can't bond against that like you can with a TIF bond. And so we had to take it from reserves and all these other things. It turns out they've paid it back through their revenues much quicker than we'd even estimated, which is another benefit of a small project-based TIF. Sometimes you can be conservative and see a return. I think this is an idea whose time is more than come, and particularly the housing crisis, it allows people to be much more nimble. So I'm happy to take any questions.
So I really appreciate your testimony, and I just want to add one piece that's really important about TIFs is that it's a general obligation debt to the town. So they're not going to take on this debt unless they really have good confidence that those projects are going to come.
And the voters aren't going to support it. We got asked a lot of questions.
So my question to you is, would you speak to how, in your experience, and I know you have a lot of experience in this, would you argue that TIFs also do a great job of motivating and driving more infill growth so that we can target growth in areas that maybe already have brown sites, as opposed to discouraging it from going further out into the undeveloped areas surrounding our metropolitan areas?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think, you know, my opinion would be, right now, the TIFs are all in urban areas. And that, you know, and they can be used for brownfield. You can use TIF roads for brownfield cleanup. I think to the extent that was still allowed. You know, if you're concerned about TIFs, you know, so first of all, I prefer to see them available to all communities. And frankly, I'm not opposed to keeping the single districts. I think they're cumbersome, but for those that wish to have them, you know, St. Albans is an example, Winooski is an example, those people still use this program to great success. And they certainly should be penalized. I mean, the turnaround in both those cities is remarkable, and it's largely due to their aggressive use of the TIF. So please don't take that tool away from those that need it. But, you know, I think any, you know, project-based TIF would really be if somebody wants info. What we have to remember is the TIF is funding public infrastructure. That's needed. So if somebody's building on a street that's already a street and already has water and sewer, and already has access to what other public is in the street, like, you know, I mean, what other public infrastructure does it need? We don't use that money to go back to the private developer. It is what is the, whereas, you know, if it's a new area, like here, where we have a parking lot, where they needed a parking structure in order to build a second hotel. So that was creating public infrastructure that our public was also going to benefit from, creating building more parking than the hotel needed. So I'm sure I talked all the way around your question, I'm sorry.
Well done.
From the master. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anytime, I really hope.
This is the first time I think this bill has come before, at the end, in the middle of huge housing bills, with huge tax credits, which is another creative way we finance projects and sacrifice revenue to the general fund. So I'm going on to Joseph Gunter from Fairhaven. Is Joseph here, up there? We are. He's on Zoom and he's not on till 2:40.
He's not in the waiting room.
He is in the waiting room?
He's not.
He's not, okay, so Abby, do you want to go move you up? And maybe if we get ahead, the committee can get a few breaks before we have the auditor come in and talk about the town of Hartford's TIF inspection. This is our TIF.
For the record, Abby Sherman, Executive Director for the Vermont Economic Progress Council. And I just want to point out Angie Farrington, there in the back, she is the.
Angie has introduced herself.
Okay. Pepsi Program Manager. She's been with Pepsi for a year now. She does a stellar job. So I just wanted to kind of go over my view of how the program would work, having worked for Pepsi for I think 6 years now, I've lost track. And TIF really being my favorite of the two programs. I want to point out, it's not for the smallest towns with limited staff. It's for smaller towns, not the smallest, but smaller towns. Or towns who have just one project they need help to move forward with. Those towns, they need to have the capacity to manage the project in-house or they can receive assistance from a coordinating agency, which is identified in the bill. And that could be a regional planning commission or a consultant. They can hire an outside consultant. And they currently do this when they access grants. So they're familiar with the process. And I provided to the committee a comparison of TIF districts and what a project-based TIF might look like. And I used Hartford as my example, so I know you're familiar with Hartford. So I just kind of want to go over that a little bit. The Hartford TIF district is 127 acres, over 127 acres. It has 146 parcels. The original taxable value was $33.5 million. In their original plan, they had identified 14 public improvement projects. They've identified about 10 or more debt incurrences, anticipating about 13 million in debt, but they anticipated a total increase in their grand list of over 47 million. I think you're all familiar with generally how TIF districts work. For the project-based TIF, using Hartford again, their district, and I think a lot of them are kind of this way, they're like a bunch of project-based TIFs combined into one district. So it's very easy for me to pull out one project and show you what the private improvements were because of the public infrastructure. So I used Prospect Street as an example, which just originally had an older building. They needed, in order to develop that land, which it's about 5 acres of land, they needed to upgrade the town water, the wastewater, the stormwater sewer systems, a realignment of the road, reconstruction and extension of the existing road, underground utilities, lighting, landscaping. They needed to address the river embankment. They added a public park, a walkway, and intersection improvements with Maple Street. The total project cost, which these are 2014 costs, so figure for a lot of inflation, 900,000. Plus, they had an additional 178,000 in non-TIF sources that they used. Since that project has been developed, the grand list for those parcels has increased by over $4.5 million. The original value of those parcels was $545,000. And I just heard from Laurie Hirschfield this morning that the third lot in those parcels has been permitted for 42 units of mixed income housing. So it's continuing to be developed. Enormous return on investment for those parcels. So that's sort of the example of how a TIF district would be different from a project-based TIF project. TIF districts have multiple projects, multiple bond votes, multiple private developments over a long period of time. Project-based TIF is one project, one bond vote, one or very few parcels over a short period of time. As soon as the project is done, all the town is doing is tracking the increases in the grand list and paying debt, receiving the tax increment and paying debt. And a lot of that already happens in the background in their grand list module as far as the increases in value, and then they transfer that increment to their TIF fund. Again,
Sorry, can I jump in? The increase in the grand list, do they do just the specific increase in the grand list from the TIF supported projects? Or do they do just the aggregate increase in the grand list?
so it currently in the grand list module, it has been set up that parcels are identified if they're within a TIF district. So any increases in value.
From the TIF district?
Right, so
Okay.
project-based TIF would work the same way. The parcels would be identified in the module, and any increases in value
Okay,
goes to the TIF.
thanks. I should have read that.
No, well, I mean, we're all learning this.
So they can, again, the town can hire a project manager to track and implement the project or a coordinating agency. And I also provided a sample of what the reporting requirements might be for a project-based TIF, using what we currently use for TIF districts and paring that down, keeping out all the items that are not required, as outlined in the bill. Try to just demystify that a little bit, what the annual reporting requirements are. So some of the changes that are in this legislation that is different from prior years, some of them are based partially on the Community Recovery and Revitalization Program. Some of them are based on feedback from towns. One requirement is that they need to demonstrate leveraging of other sources of funding, the non-TIF revenues. They cannot have a full reliance on TIF to repay this project. They need to demonstrate an ability to manage the project. So whether they hire someone to help them with that, or they have internal staff capacity to complete that. And those two requirements came from the Community Recovery and Revitalization Program. And they also need to have a plan for fiscal viability. And this is a form that the VEPC staff would help develop. We have a similar model that we use for TIF districts, and we would just pare it down for the project-based TIFs. Another thing from community recovery is continuing with the list of towns with stagnant or declining grand lists as part of the review process. We've also allowed for a little more time for towns to incur debt. I think prior legislation gave them 3 years to incur their debt. This bill proposes, I think it's 5 years. And I think how we would implement this is similar to what we currently use with TIF districts for master TIF determinations, where we essentially get pre-approval, say generally it looks like this is a good plan, this will work. They've established what their district is, so project-based TIF would be their TIF zone, and then come back to us and we will confirm viability. Come back to us with project-based TIF when you have a more definitive answer of what your plans might be and what the actual project development, private development would be. And then you can move forward, get voter approval, and do your project. Also allowing for the funding of debt service reserves, which I know this is controversial, but my feeling is why would you take away one tool from the toolbox, which towns are already allowed to use, which is take out additional debt in order to pay for debt in those first years? Why would you take one tool out of the toolbox? for this other
I
town.
think this
Give them all the
committee
tools.
has put that in, but I'm not sure it's ever made it all the way through. We've done it, I think, twice, because this is the St. Albans issue,
Yes.
borrowing, yeah. And we did that and lost it in COVID. It was going to be presented the day we got sent home. I think the deal was we let mini TIFs go, and the trade-off was the St. Albans corrections to the whole TIF statute got put on the year later, and that didn't make it through.
We tried a few times, so.
Maybe, I'm almost certain there was a third time, but let's hope the third or fourth time may be the charm. Because that is something that towns regularly do. You're not gonna have any development there by the time your first payment is ready. You've gotta get the water and sewer in first. Okay.
Another change is increasing the share of tax increment, 80% of education rather than the 70% that was in prior years. And to offset that 100% of municipal tax increment would need to go in. Again, the idea is that chances are the private development is, may or may not be, maybe it will be, that would be wonderful if it was, but may not be enough tax increment to repay the debt. You know, it's not going to fully repay the debt. So give them a little bit more to ensure that they're going to be successful. Also changing the length of time to retain increment. Some bonds, I think drinking water revolving loan fund is an example, allow you to borrow for 40 years. So if we're saying you can only retain increment for 20 years, suddenly the town, this project is going to fall off a cliff and they don't have that additional tax revenue coming in. So why would we do that to them? Allow them to borrow it for the term of their debt service, the whole time. Again, we're only talking about few parcels here, much smaller acres. It's not a full district. And it's also in the legislation, anything not specifically spelled out in statute, that's the would adopt policies which are consistent with TIF rule. I do have some other notes that I've made too. Comparing, oftentimes people just say, well, why don't we just add a new grant program? There are a lot of differences. First of all, with TIF, it requires the private development. You may not get that with a grant. You may just install the infrastructure or fix infrastructure, and you're not necessarily getting that increase in grant list value. This requires it. It gives the state a return on the investment. It also requires a private developer to come to the table at the same time. And it doesn't require the state to provide upfront funds the way a grant would. It's not
Okay, so
coming
it's
directly out of
not
the
just
state
if
coffers.
we build it, they will come, so we're gonna run this water and sewer line. It's, they've come and they sent us a smoke signal and said, if you put the water sewer line in, we'll come. And
We use the money come, you use the money to pay back
the debt,
what you borrow.
yes, okay,
But there's a missing thing.
you want us to charge interest,
When you go to borrow money, you go to the bank
yes,
and you pay it back.
yes,
But the ed fund doesn't get paid back. And it doesn't, the ed fund isn't paid principal, waiting for the money to go to the ed fund.
Right.
It's a forgivable loan.
it's, yeah, it's a state service. We're having that discussion again.
But it is
We're trying to
right.
understand when we're using words that the auditor would accept as,
As valid, and the auditor will be,
But it is money that wouldn't be there at all if not
well,
for.
that's the
how-
leap.
if it's not there, how
That's
come it's building the
That's
infrastructure?
the leap of faith.
Yeah. No, it is counting your chickens before they hatch. I get that, but these chickens have hatched. I mean, the prediction turned out as hoped.
We're gonna let Abby finish her.
The last point that I have is in the legislation, it does identify that towns need to have their TIF fund audited every year. And I'm sure this is going to come up because it's come up previously with the project-based TIF program, is that they should be subject to a state audit as well. And I would suggest rather than putting that burden on the town, because it is a significant burden to have the state auditor come in and audit your books, to audit the program as a whole, as if it were a grant program. That's what the auditor's office would do if this were a grant program. They would audit it as a whole. It wouldn't
So
be a
audit
burden.
all of them at once.
Audit the program, not the individual projects.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion, if the committee feels it needs to be there. I'm sure the auditor's office.
I'm sure the auditor feels it needs to be. And yeah, there is, yes, I mean, we found out that towns with a lot more resources than our small towns have made mistakes. They have their own TIF plan and didn't come in under the present law, which sets out some pretty strict guidelines. Okay.
I think a lot of the, in the newer TIF districts, those that were approved 2006 and onward, a lot of the issues that they have found have been around the grand list and parcels that were remitted. That is going to become very apparent in TIF project zones. Towns are going to know if they forgot to add a parcel because they're really counting on that money. It's so much smaller. It's going to be more evident far quicker if they forgot a parcel. So I don't think the need is as great in that respect.
Okay.
And there should be economies of scale, reviewing all towns at once and all of their friend lists at once, rather than.
Okay. Like this or wasn't the expected response.
I'm
But
sure that any of the committee members recall who in the opening statements today talked about revenue sharing.
no,
They said something about Carter administration and revenue sharing.
oh, no, they said that was the last infrastructure investment since the Carter
was-
administration. That was
Revenue share was called revenue share.
that Carter.
Well, it
I
was,
thought it was
it
Nixon.
was Nixon, it was the people
Yes.
after Nixon
Yes,
until it stopped.
that's right.
And
Yes, I remember that greatly because,
revenue sharing is defined as government units apportioning a part of government's tax income to other units of government.
yes,
And in form of grants. And that's what revenue sharing was. You collected, the federal government collected tax revenue and then parcel it out as grants. But where in this system, or other than the ed fund granting money, how does the system work?
Well, there's like HUD.
okay. I want to let this is a philosophical argument. that
Oh, it's
this
an
com-
accounting.
Okay, it's an accounting argument. This committee will have this when we are not taking up witnesses' time. Okay,
That's all I
that's it. Okay, so, and
Madam Chair.
let me finish with that. Did you, I saw your two pieces you sent us. You had other recommendations or they're in the bill about the payback time and the time you get to hold the increment.
I can
They
send
they
my-
are in the bill.
I can
Okay,
send my notes.
your notes would be fine. Okay, Mr. Fraser, if you want.
May I just two very brief comments that I neglected to mention earlier, and I think it addresses some of the questions you asked. Question about the risk. I'll just offer that most communities, and I know we are one, when you sign a development agreement with the people to go forward, they actually then take on some risk. For example, just using the hotel, we had based an estimated tax payment, and they signed an agreement that said even if their appraisal came in below that, they would still pay that same amount to the city because we had counted on that kind of money. When we've talked with the folks at Sabins Pasture, we've said, as soon as we put water lines in the ground, you're on the hook for this much tax money. So I do agree that we should be able to borrow, but I think that is one of the things that communities do to safeguard that development and also. The second thing to your question on brownfields that occurred to me afterwards, not brownfield, infill. Infill is really something that I think cities and towns can get at best with tax stabilization because there's no public infrastructure. When you have a giant TIF district you can't do tax stabilization within it because you're reducing the grant listing, so everyone else that has to pay the difference. So that's another reason why project-based, so you could, for example, we could have a project-based TIF here and then a tax stabilization next door for an inflow. Whereas under a big TIF district, you can't. So,
So you couldn't do any infill downtown because,
well, not using tax
no,
stabilization.
yeah, because the projects, yeah, all downtown is there. Okay, Mr. Gunter has joined us, I believe.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And just introduce yourself for the record. We're just taking testimony from towns on the proposal to set up mini TIF, project-based TIFs.
Sure. So my name's Joe Gunter, and I'm the town manager in Fairhaven, Vermont. Do you want me to just start right in?
Just start right in.
All right, thank you. So I'll probably be your shortest witness today. But I wanted to start by talking just a little bit about my experience moving into Vermont 5 years ago, which is not dissimilar to the experience many are having even today. So my wife and I, we moved to Vermont so I could take this job here in Fairhaven. And then, like now, the housing market was also very tight. We spent months looking for a home, and in the end, what it came down to, we were either going to buy a house that was way too much, or a house that was way too little that needed a lot of repair. We ended up going with something that was a little out of our price range, but to be able to afford that, to be able to actually move into the state and take a job that I had already, agreed to take the job, I had to liquidate some of my retirement. So I think that's telling that to even come to our state, to move to our state, you have to take such great risks financially to do that. And I think it's really limiting on our population and our growth. With that said, when I saw that S83 was up for discussion for the project-based TIF district, I had to jump in. Here in Fairhaven, which again, it's like any other town. Like I read something the other day about Jericho, who's having the same issues we're having, is that there's just not enough housing, right? And I'm speaking to the choir here, preaching to the choir, but there's a lack of housing. The housing's out there. It's an old housing stock. Rents are way up for us here in Fairhaven. And our low income housing, we have several facilities here in town. Even that housing seems to be going up, though that might just be hearsay. So my experience has been typical. But moving forward with the project-based TIF district, I really feel that this bill, the bill struck a chord with me because it could help people. It could help towns just like my town, just like Fairhaven. I have a project here in town. The man has 100 acres of land. He has a development, or what is it called? A planned development for, I want to say, 280 homes. And this was just recently. We could not get this project off the ground. We couldn't find funding. We couldn't find a way to incentivize this project. Costs for our construction companies were too high. They just weren't willing to take that risk. We did reach out. We were going to look for some grant funding for these folks to try to, hit that missing middle income housing. But as soon as I start talking about federal funding to the private sector, people back off. Our federal funds come with a lot of strings attached. And not just reporting, but also what type of housing, where you can build, what needs to be included. All those strings make it impossible for our construction companies to do this work. Some will, don't get me wrong, but many in my experience are not willing to put up with the strings. So with the project-based TIF, these kind of programs will help towns like mine kind of take control of their development dollars and incentivize this kind of work. We can say, hey, we're committed to making sure that those streets, sidewalks, water lines, excuse me, electric lines are all installed. And that's a huge incentive for our builders, which I'm sure this is probably old news for you, but that's where we sit. My big request for the bill is that we take out that low income language. It's okay to help. In my opinion, it's okay for us to help our middle income families. Our nurses need housing, our doctors need housing, our mechanics need housing. It's not just low income housing that we're lacking, especially here in Fairhaven, because we have a lot of low income housing as well. And I guess that's where I'll end. I'll end that we don't need necessarily so much low income housing in my town as we just need less expensive housing. So thank you. So thank you for taking the time.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? I am not seeing any, so thank you. Do you have municipal water and sewer?
We do, and we have a great deal of excess capacity.
Okay, but you would probably need to run some lines out to this proposed.
No, in fact, so the water line and sewer lines that are there, they run right past the property. It's really, the only hindrance to this project was the cost of building. And people weren't willing to take that risk right now, aren't willing to take the risk.
Yeah, in the housing committee, we've heard testimony about that.
You're
Just
still
about
at
double. Yes.
public hearing, so thank you for that.
Okay,
And it's to chime in one more time, sorry to take up so much time. We here in Fairhaven, we're right on the highway that leads right into Rutland, and Rutland is our employment center. We have a GE plant, we have a large hospital. These two large employers are looking for homes for their workers. So it's not like there's not a demand. There's a huge demand in our area for that missing middle housing. It's just we need to find a way to make it lucrative for our builders.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
All right, we'll see you later.
We will see you. Gail, is
Neither from Hartford can come.
no one from Hartford is here? Okay, then we're on break until 3:30? Okay. And no one is coming from Hartford at 3:30. We just got the auditor.
What about berries?
Barry hasn't gotten out for, I've had the request in, and I signed it out Friday. It's just taken a long time to get things out. The insurance bill I just signed out.
Oh, yeah, I know, I have the same problem.
Barry is one page. This is 40.
I know, right?
That was 45 pages.